But I looked at him and I watched him do the speech live, and I was just thinking to myself, you've not got it. Whatever the X factor is in politics, Kier Starmer does not have it. He's not connecting with people. He had all summer to write that speech, to deliver it, whatever. He had the ability to show us things about himself, to do light and shade, to, to take us on a journey, to explain what Britain was going to look like in 5 or 10 years, or what he was trying to get to, all of that sort of thing. He did none of that. And I was just looking at him going, you are beatable. You are immensely beatable.
I'm Ben Houchin. This is the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home, and we're going to lift the lid on centre-right politics in the UK. We're going to be speaking with influential figures from across the political spectrum to help understand how we can make centre-right politics relevant to people's lives again and turn it back into a political force for good. Well, my guest today is Ruth Davidson, a Scottish politician, was the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party between 2011 and 2019. Ruth Davidson, I think it's fair to say, single-handedly responsible for revitalising the opportunities and the prospects of the Conservative Party in Scotland, and more recently is now been appointed to the House of Lords in 2021 as a life peer. Ruth Davidson, absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here, Ben. Thanks so much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. I apologise to all of the listeners listening to this Blueprint podcast today. This is the first time we've done this down the line outside of the studio. But Ruth, I thought, is a consummate professional at this type of thing. So it's great to have a professional on who does this down the line more regularly than I do.
Well, also, I mean, it's just basically that I'm in Scotland all the time. So I try, as much as London is one of the world's great cities, I don't have any, everybody always assumes that any politician has their own accommodation down there. I don't, or that they live down there. I don't, never have. So my home, my family, my son's school, everything is in Scotland. So I go down when I need to, and otherwise I am here, and it's amazing what tech can do. You can make everything work.
Absolutely, isn't it? And exactly the same as me. I'm very rarely in London, or nowhere near as in London as much as people think that I am. What's interesting, though, and this is where I really wanted to start with the podcast, is exactly a little bit about you, Ruth, that bit outside of politics, because, again, people will see you on other podcasts, they'll see you on the TV, they'll have seen your political career, but people see us usually in a very narrow window and tend not to think about the person behind the political persona, I suppose. So it'd be really interesting, I think, for Blueprint podcast listeners to understand, your background, where you're from, and your journey into politics.
So I always kind of describe myself as a Scottish mongrel, in that my parents are Glaswegian. I was born in Edinburgh. I grew up in the Borders and then in Fife, and I've variously lived as an adult in Edinburgh, Perth, and Glasgow. So kind of central belt Scotland, but moved around quite a bit. In terms of my kind of life now, so after I left Holyrood in 2021, I moved out of Edinburgh, the sort of city centre of Edinburgh, where I'd been representing. I was the Edinburgh Central MSP. I moved out and I moved down the coast into East Lothian, which is the next sort of county along. We live by the beach. So I've got a 5-year-old son, my partner, Jen, and we've got 2 dogs. Our second puppy was a new arrival this summer, so he's keeping us all very busy. So we've got a Cocker Spaniel called Wilson and a cross between an Irish setter and a poodle that's called Fergus. So he's our new addition. They get walked down the beach every day, and a lot of it revolves around my son Finn and his kind of school and all his clubs, and he started rugby and football and swimming and tennis and all these things that you do. So I'm very much taxi of mum.
Well, one of the things you might be able to help me with, Ruth, is I've just had our first child, Hannah, who's now 7 months old, but we did have a dog just before we had Hannah, and the difficulty is managing a small child and a dog, so I'm not entirely sure how you do it with 2 dogs and children.
Yeah, so, I'd been pestering my partner for years to get a dog, and then it was after an election, she finally capitulated, and I think it was the 2016 Scottish election, and as soon as we got him, I immediately thought, God, I wish we'd got him before, because you meet so many people walking the dog that there was infinitely lots of votes in it. I had a majority of 600.
There is a full community, isn't there?
There is a full community, and I had a majority of 610, so it was a really small majority in Edinburgh Central. And I think I could have given myself breathing space if we'd got Wilson before the election rather than after. But yeah, he was devastated when we brought Finn home from the hospital. So he had always sort of been my dog, even though he was our dog. He'd attached himself to me. And then something happened when I was about maybe 7 months pregnant, he decided he was Jen's dog, and then we posted a picture the day we brought Finn home from the hospital, and we had this, like, somebody had sent us a really nice little neckerchief that says Big Brother Wilson on it or something like that, and we tied that around his neck and stuff. And the look of just absolute pain and betrayal in his eyes when we brought this child home. They're actually very good friends now, so I don't know, what kind of dog have you got?
Well, it's a miniature schnauzer, and that is, to be honest, Ruth, I mean, we're going off piste here, and this might turn into a dog podcast for this episode. But one of the things you've just said there, we're having a bit of a problem with Boris the dog, because we found that he's changed a little bit. He's kind of sulking. He's not particularly happy, and I kind of feel like the dynamics have changed since Hannah's been there. So it's nice to know that they became friends in the end, because my wife Rachel is really upset that Boris is not happy with the new environment that he finds himself in.
Yeah, so I think some of it's kind of breed temperament. So Cocker Spaniels, he was in the huff for a good year, easily a year, maybe even a year and a half, and then sorted himself completely out, and they're very, very good friends now. And he loves jumping up on the sofa for sofa cuddles with the family and all the rest of it. Absolutely happy days. However, my limited knowledge of schnauzers is they're quite highly anxious dogs. They're a bit less chill. I mean, spaniels are mad, but kind of soft as butter and very affectionate and stuff. And my understanding is that a schnauzer can bear a grudge. So I don't know.
Well, you're absolutely right. He's definitely got a little bit more jumpy, and he seems a little bit more on tenterhooks than he used to be, and it's definitely the dynamic. But like I say, I now hold on to the hope that in about a year's time they'll be best friends again, and they'll be back to normal.
They will. And I actually think having pets around is great for kids, just in terms of them learning boundaries and looking after things and empathy and all that sort of stuff. I actually think it's great to have pets in the house with kids.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. But you were just saying as well, one of the things you didn't touch upon, before you were in politics, I understand that you were a journalist. Is that where you started out in your professional career, or?
Yeah. So it's funny, I went to university wanting to be an English teacher, and studied English literature at Edinburgh, and came out deciding that actually what I really wanted to be was Kate, the war correspondent.
Right.
So I mean, a bit of a change. I don't quite know what happened, but yeah, decided specifically I wanted to be Kate. So I started off where all good journalists do, which was on their local paper, which was the hugely influential Glenrothes Gazette, incorporating the Leslie and Markinch News. Oh yes,
shout out.
And then I know. And then from there, I went to my kind of local radio station to be a newsreader and reporter, and then to there I went to a kind of regional radio station, and then BBC after that. So I kind of worked my way up the chain.
You kind of come a bit full circle now, post-politics, with the work you're doing with Sky and the podcast and other things like that.
Yeah, so when I was at the BBC, I was mostly working in radio, and then like all kind of people in their 20s who are desperate to, make a name for themselves, was desperate to get into television. And then as soon as I made it and got a kind of gig where I was doing kind of TV reporting and politics reporting on the television, I realised how cumbersome a medium television is and how it really gets in the way of telling a story. So I went almost immediately back to radio, and I presented a kind of news and current affairs sort of 2-hour drive time programme. Co-presented it. It was a two-hander for the, sort of my last 5 years at the BBC. So sort of a Scottish version of kind of 5 Live Drive with just a bit less sport in it. Or maybe the PM programme, sort of a mix of those sort of things. So like multiple stories daily, keeping people updated with the news, and loved it, absolutely loved it. And then when I left politics, or when I left the leadership, I went back and did a kind of thing for LBC for just under a year, where I because I was still in Parliament, I kind of gave the fee for that to a cancer charity.
Okay.
And then when I left Holyrood, as well as some of the corporate stuff I do, I took a gig at Times Radio. So I did a Friday session for Times for just over 2 years. And we changed that up in March. I left there in order to do the podcast with Sky. But I have always loved speech radio. I've always loved interviewing people and hearing their stories. And I just think humans have an oral history. Like, I think people just and I've always thought politics is about telling a story, and it's the communication. It's not just about telling a policy or telling somebody what a budget line is. It's about telling the story of why you're doing the policy and what that's going to change and who that's going to affect and how the country works. So I don't actually see politics and journalism as using particularly different skills. I think you're just on the opposite side of a microphone. You've got very different roles about holding people to account, about being able to be held to account and presenting yourself. But actually, I think having been in broadcasting helped me immeasurably as a politician.
And how did you then make that transition from journalism into politics?
With difficulty. I mean, you do have to, if you're in news journalism, I mean, as soon as you stand, you can't go back. You cut your ties. So I, like I say,
Had you always been a conservative? Is that something that you've just
yeah,
had in the background?
yeah. So there's I shouldn't say this because somebody will go and find it in the archives. But when I was at high school, there was I don't know, a journalist that was doing a feature piece for a Sunday magazine for one of the papers called the Safi syndrome. And for those of you with long enough memories, it was named after Safi from Absolutely Fabulous. So it was about really kind of conscientious, sort of sensible teenage women who were much more serious about the world than their parents' generation had been. So that kind of dynamic, and they interviewed loads of different kids from loads of different schools, like everything from posh schools like Rodine to the school that I went to in Buckhaven, which was not posh. And for whatever reason, I was told to go and speak to this journalist, and like there's bits in it about talking about being a conservative and Margaret Thatcher and all this other stuff. So yes, it's not just that I say it, I have actually lived it. And let me tell you, growing up in Fife in the 90s, there was not that many conservatives about. So I definitely learned early how to defend my position.
But a big risk as well, transitioning from what was clearly, something you loved doing, the career that you had, into taking a risk for standing for conservative politics in Scotland.
Yeah, and my mother was appalled. Like, I had this lovely 4-day-a-week job working for the BBC with a pension. Ruth, it's got a pension attached to it. It's a good pension.
Was she appalled at the politics, or was she appalled at
my
the
parents
career
are
choice?
No, both my parents are working class Glaswegians. Like I said, they both grew up in council houses. Left school at my mum at 15, my dad at 16. Myself and my sister, first generation of our extended family to go to university, all of that kind of aspirational working class Tory kind of background, but they were both conservatives, and I've always believed in kind of hard work, effort, responsibility, community values. We used to have a politician up in Scotland called David McCletchy that talked about your kind of tenement stair Tory, and he was basically like, working class Tories in Scotland were the people that always took their turn at cleaning the tenement step. And that's kind of the background that my parents came from and how I was raised. So she wasn't appalled at the politics, but she was appalled at the idea that I would gamble a good job on not very much certainty. And, I'm trying to get elected in Glasgow in the 2010s, as a Tory was an incredible gamble. And it took me several years. I sort of went back to university while I was trying to do this, did a by-election, did the general election, then got elected at the Scottish election. So it took me a while. We'd had to move back into my then partner's mother's ex-council house because we couldn't afford the rent because I wasn't earning. It wasn't a two household anymore. So I really kind of, it could have all gone horribly, horribly wrong. But I've always kind of believed if you want to do something and you believe in it and you work hard enough, you can make things happen. You can make things happen for yourself. So we did eventually.
And it seems to me that there are lots of similarities between what you were doing in Scotland and what I see in places like Teesside and the Red Wall in the north of England. What was it that made you a conservative? I mean, I don't want to tell you my story. People don't want to listen to my story, but I suspect there are probably some parallels. Why was it just your parents, or was there things that going on around you that influenced that?
Yeah, so a lot of it was going on around me. So I loved my school. So Buckhaven High School was 1,500 people, comprehensive, took in lots of kind of ex-mining communities and former dock communities. I think we euphemistically call it a Centre for Multiple Indices of Deprivation now, but it just meant there was loads of kids on free school meals.
Yeah.
And actually, I found the statism of it all quite stifling. So the idea that the local authority told you where to live, like what house you had to have, you were constrained in where you could work because of what bus routes they put on, and obviously, and also the kind of the poverty of ambition and the way that we were written off because we were a poor area, as if crime was just okay or drug use was just okay. And there was a lot of drug use around where I grew up. And I just, I was looking at, some of the kids that were like really bright kids in my school who were, that did have the free school meal pass and all the rest of it. And we were lucky that my dad was pretty much always working and doing all right for himself. But going, do you know, they're not choosing to do some of these things that I'm seeing in the media as being written off as just, as just stuff that happens in poor communities. Let's have more ambition here. And I think, when I talk about conservative values, that idea of choice, of freedom, but also of responsibility, and those three things going in cohort, and the idea as well that the state doesn't make the best decisions about individual people's lives. It just doesn't. And this idea, I've always believed that if somebody goes out to work, that the pounds that they earn that are in their pocket is better spent by them making choices about their family than it is about some nameless, faceless, statist civil servant or person that works for the local authority who doesn't know them, who doesn't know their family, who doesn't know their needs. And that's probably why I'm a kind of low tax Tory, if you like, is it's that, like, give people the opportunities to make decisions for themselves, and more likely than not, if you trust people, they will make the best decisions that they can. Make sure that there are services available, that there are opportunities available. Make sure that you've got a labor market that works. Make sure that you're pulling the big levers. You've got an economy that works, that you've got jobs out there for people to go to. But if you do that, people will, by and large, do the best that they can with what they have, and they will go on to do better and better. And let's not cut people off at the knees and tell them that they shouldn't have ambition.
I find it's a really interesting thing in that there seems to be some schizophrenia in the way that people talk about this, because they on one hand say, nobody really likes the government, nobody really likes their local council, but it seems to be that when we get to election times and lots of politicians kind of say, well, the state and the government have the answers, and people then get sucked into this conversation about, well, what is the government doing and what should it be doing more? But then outside of election time, nobody likes the government, thinks it doesn't work particularly efficiently, it doesn't do the things it's supposed to do. It's that balance, isn't it? Because you also touched upon there, Ruth, because I agree. There are roles in which the state has a place, particularly around that enabling infrastructure to be able to, entice and support the private sector to succeed, to be able to create the environment that we want. But it's interesting to try and figure out, well, where do you sit on that spectrum of how much intervention should there be from the state? You talk about being a low-tax conservative, but I think maybe it's just me, but instinctively you never come across as kind of a right-wing, small state end of the party.
Sorry. I mean, I'm probably in the conservative sort of scion. I'm probably not that low tax, and I'm not
it's all relative, a
John Redwood type.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm centre-right politics is that I genuinely believe that the pound in the pocket is better spent by the person that earned it than it is by the state. I just, that is just something that seems so obvious to me that I find it hard to see past that. However, I mean, I think that there's a big debate that's going on, or actually there's not. I think that there is a debate that should be going on post-COVID about what the role of the government is. Because actually I think I've seen quite a bit of drift. And it might be that the consensus within the country is that we want the government to be doing all of these other things as well. But it might be that we want to kind of self-correct to kind of pre-COVID eras.
How did you, given your political philosophy, given where the Conservatives were when you were trying to stand and then first elected in Scotland, how did you take the Conservative Party in Scotland from that, which probably at the time wasn't part of the zeitgeist of where Scotland and the Scottish public were, and create the movement that you did and become such a successful political force? Because a lot of it, as you say, and I believe this, big part of politics is communication. How did you take those Conservative values and communicate them to people, which allowed them to support you in the Scottish Conservatives?
Well, I think, first of all, I do a little kind of correction for you, Ben, when you said that I single-handedly did some things when you did your introduction. I really didn't. I had a brilliant team around me that worked so exceptionally hard, and yes, I was the front man, but in terms of people like my party director, Mark McInnes, sort of activists up and down the country, we had some really good people around us, and it was bringing them together and making sure that we're all pointing in the same direction made a big difference.
And was that a moment in time, or were those people always there over the years?
No, some of them had been there for decades.
Right.
And I think it's, I mean, you'll know yourself from politics and Teesside and how you've completely confounded some of the kind of pundits out there, that if you go and ask, if you go and find good people and say, I need your skills, you're exactly the sort of person that we need. Will you come and do a job for me? Will you help me? People want to. They really do want to help, and they want to put the shoulder to the wheel. And I think the first thing that I tried to do was to change the mindset of the party, because we'd had sort of ever decreasing returns at Scottish elections. So we'd had 4 elections where we'd gone down and down and down in terms of vote share and seats. And the one that I was elected to in 2011, I think we were down at like 12.5% of the vote. We'd also had multiple general elections where we'd only had 1 or 0 MPs returned. So we were kind of 20 years worth of kind of stagnation and decline. And we were also beaten up a lot by our opponents. Politics is a rough business. We're the only centre-right party in a 5-party parliament in Holyrood, where all other 4 parties are centre-left. So, we are the bogeyman that gets beaten up a lot. And, we were a bit downtrodden as an organisation. A lot of our members would start a conversation with, I'm sorry, I'm a Tory, but here's this really good idea. If you listen to the idea and forget what kind of rosette I wear, maybe we can talk about the idea. And didn't get very far. And the first thing I wanted to do was to say, no, look, let's stand up and have a bit of confidence. Let's say, here's this really great idea that will benefit Scotland. I believe in that idea. I believe in the values behind that idea. And if you believe in that idea, well, maybe you're a Tory too. Or even if you're not, maybe you'll lend us your vote in order to make this idea happen. So there was a bit of confidence, and it was silly things like visual cues. Like I went and got HQ to buy an absolute job lot of bright fluorescent blue cagoules and made everybody wear them. So we weren't going incognito to places. You would actually physically see us. I went out and completely transformed our candidates list and changed the way in which you became a candidate. Made sure that we got people from lots of different backgrounds. Because for me, the message is only as good as the message carriers, and they've got to come from your community. And went out and said, look, I don't care what age you are, I don't care what school you went to, I don't care what education you have, I don't care what job you do, don't care about any of that. Do you do things for your community? Are you involved in a local charity? Are you involved in the church? Are you willing to serve? That's what I want. And then obviously we kind of screened and supported people in terms of being able to public speak, being able to organise how you do the work of being a politician, that sort of thing. We also kind of stripped back what the offering was, and started talking first at values and then added policies on top of that, because the values of hard work, aspiration, that speaks to lots of lots of Scots, in the same ways it speaks to people in other parts of the United Kingdom. We started talking about responsibility. We started talking about law and order. We started talking about home ownership. We started talking about all of these, and we sort of stripped it right back, and then built it back up, and found that we had a willing audience. And also, in terms of my role as the leader, we had this big debate at the time about the independence referendum. So I was elected in 2011 in the May. I became leader 6 months later by the November. So I made loads of mistakes. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd only been a professional politician for 6 months by the time I started leading the party. But the biggest issue at the time was whether Scotland would stay in the United Kingdom or not. And it's something I cared very deeply about. And I was able to talk about it from a political sense, but also a personal sense. So, at that point, I was living and working in Glasgow. My sister lived and worked in Newcastle. My best mate lived and worked in Liverpool. 3 cities more alike you could not find. My background had been in the reserve forces, in the armed forces, and also in the BBC, 2 big UK-wide organisations that I cared very deeply about. And I was able to talk about these things. So when I was talking about the political messaging of the referendum, I was able to talk about my own life, and it chimed with other people as well. So it is about telling that story and about revealing yourself and showing people what you're made of, why you believe it. And I think my background helped, actually, because the one thing I learned as a presenter and sort of news radio was that loads of people, even if they're not that into news or that into politics, can understand the kind of cues that people give them. So they know if a politician's being questioned, whether the politician is answering the question they're being asked. They know if the politician believes what they're saying, and they know if they're just giving a line that they don't believe. So like just answer the questions that you're asked, believe what you say, don't say anything that you're trying to triangulate, just actually go out and say what you believe. And I personally think that you get much more credit even from people who disagree with you, who think, well, we'll give her a shot, than you get if you were constantly triangulating and trying to do the kind of Peter Mandelson soundbite nonsense that doesn't tell anybody anything. I think honest communication, you get points for that,
Yeah, I mean, I think just authenticity, right? That's what it comes down to. Because people, I absolutely agree, can see through whether somebody's kind of putting on a front or holding a line. They can feel
100%.
there's something intuitive about somebody's authenticity or not. And in politics, I think that's as important as any time. Because then straight away, if you're not authentic, then you become untrustworthy, and then you get into kind of the stereotypical tropes of what a politician is. Never mind potentially a conservative politician in what is traditionally not a conservative area. I suppose just reflecting back on that, because again, we talk about the success of you and your team. Do you think that success and all of those things you put in place, do you think that was accelerated and you were as successful as you were because of the catalyst of the independence referendum? Do you think
100%.
do you think the curve would have been very different had that not been front and centre at the time? Because that felt like it was a platform for you to rebuild the party, but actually you grabbed with both
completely.
hands and gave an offer to the country.
Yeah, completely. And in the same way that, to a different degree, Brexit sort of shook up the kaleidoscope of UK politics as well.
Yeah.
I think what the referendum did was that it opened a number of doors, and it was up to the individual parties and the people leading those parties if they chose to walk through them. I think I was also immeasurably helped, as politics is a zero-sum game, by the Scottish Labour Party trying to triangulate after the election, and they had a leader at the time called Jim Murphy who was talking about, I'm not a unionist, I'm a trade unionist, and blah blah blah. And actually, the echoes of the independence referendum lasted quite a long time here. And then when Brexit happened 2 years later, and you had Nicola Sturgeon saying, look, Brexit means that we need to have another independence referendum because Scotland didn't vote for this. You had the Scottish Labour leader who replaced Jim Murphy, who's a woman called Kezia Dugdale, was kind of swithering about whether that meant it or not. I chose to stand up and go, look, I fought as hard to remain as anybody else in Scotland. I was the one that was up at Wembley doing the debate. But don't you dare, Nicola Sturgeon, take my Remain vote and tell me that was a vote for independence, because it wasn't. And there are thousands of Scots out there like me who frankly believe in wider unions completely, whether that is working together in the wider union of the United Kingdom or working together as the United Kingdom in the wider union of Europe, of the EU. So don't bastardize my vote. Don't you dare. You don't have ownership of that. And I think because I'd been so firm, people were a bit like, oh yeah, it's not inevitable now that we have to have another referendum. Actually, somebody will stand up and shout against that. So I think it wasn't just the post 2014 part, so post the independence referendum when we had a general election in 2015, but I think it was that post Brexit referendum. And I think actually, I think Nicola Sturgeon, if I may be so bold as to critique her choices, I think she made a kind of category 1 error in the fact that the last votes from Brexit referendum hadn't even been counted before she was on the television saying, right, this means that we must have an independence referendum. Like the game's changed, the ball's burst. Let's take our goalposts and go home. Let's start again. Scotland wants out. I think if she had stood up and said, nobody thought this was going to happen. This was against the kind of form book. This is clearly a massive challenge for all parts of the UK, including Scotland. I'm going to work very hard with people right across the UK to find out what the course is that we chart now. If she'd done that and then 6 months later come back and said, look, I've tried to work with a shower. It's completely impossible. There is a life raft for Scotland. Let's have a look at this. I think she would have got much more momentum. I'm not saying it would have necessarily happened or not, but I think she would have got much more momentum and she would have had a fighting chance at it. But I think she went too early, and I think she, I think she flubbed it. I think she flopped it.
Well, you also talk about the shadow of the independence referendum. I'm slightly removed from Scottish politics. I don't profess to be an expert in it, but it always seems to me that now more than ever, actually, that the independence argument, and whether you're a unionist or a separatist or however people choose to identify, informs the politics even more so than it used to in Scotland. I mean, and I think we've seen that in recent Holyrood elections as well, have we not? Or do you think that's a mischaracterisation of where we currently stand?
So I think, when the result came in, I was expecting, if we won, and if we won handsomely, and everybody thought at the time that sort of 10.5, 11 points was tight, and then we found out from Brexit that actually that's quite a big margin in a binary referendum.
Absolutely.
I thought that I would be sort of cheering from the rafters, and actually the only thing I kind of felt was relief, because it became quite a nasty campaign in Scotland. It was quite difficult for people, and it split families, and it split communities, and there was a lot of bad feeling afterwards.
But even the way you're talking about when you moved on to the Brexit discussion and Nicola Sturgeon, you've communicated that very much through kind of the independence lens, and a lot of it felt like from Scotland that's how it was all perceived.
Yeah, what I didn't understand when the result came in was that there would be no loser's consent. So obviously, I'd never expected the SNP to give up the idea of Scottish independence. I mean, that's what it exists for. But I didn't expect them to sort of day one, ground one, say we're now planning for the next one. And it really was that quick. And obviously, it was because more people, 45%, is a huge number of votes. As it became longer in government, so it had been in government, the SNP's been in government in Scotland since 2007. As it was longer in government, it became clear that Scottish independence as a concept was more popular than the SNP as a political party. So it became very much in the interest of the SNP to make sure that Scottish independence was the biggest issue in Scotland for as long as they could, because they picked up votes from that and they preserved everything else. And they also believed that they could, get with one more push, one more heave, they'd be able to get another indie ref and they get over the line. And if you're the government, you have the biggest microphone, you've got the biggest platform. So it was almost, I'm not going to say artificially kept alive, but it was kept alive in a much bigger way than we saw with Brexit. I mean, I think we saw a tentpole of it in the 2019 election, where the kind of "Get Brexit Done" message for the Conservatives obviously worked incredibly well, because it spoke to both people that didn't like it and just wanted it in the rearview mirror, as well as people that desperately wanted it to happen, having been promised it, and then it not having happened for those 3 years post the vote. But yeah, the echoes of Scottish independence have lasted so long in Scotland, and are only really now beginning to die down. Only now are we beginning to see a situation where voters in Scotland are listening to the ideas and all the rest of it, rather than going, okay, which side is this coming from? If it's coming from my side, then I'll listen. If it's coming from the other side, then I won't. So we're only now kind of getting past that.
And where do you think that leaves the Scottish Conservative Party at the moment? Because one thing that people don't realise is that there is also a Scottish Conservative leadership election going on at the same time.
Yeah, and it's going to finish before the UK one as well. So
it's
due to finish in September, whereas the UK one's in November. So yeah.
And so how do we think that's going to play out? And what impact do you think that is going to have as the Conservative and Unionist Party from a UK perspective, depending on who's elected and how that leadership election's playing out?
Yeah, so I think... So it's interesting. So there's two front runners. The first actually is the person that stood against, one of the people that stood against me in 2011, and he was the deputy leader at the time, and his big idea was that actually we should, because we'd had sort of, like I say, 20 years of stagnation and decline, that we should split the party off. We should stop being the Scottish Conservatives. It could be a different party that's a sister party, but not part of the UK Conservatives. So sort of like the CSU, CDU version in Germany.
And that's been a conversation that's reared its head every few years, hasn't it? There's always somebody that comes forward and says, actually, we're not the Conservative Party, we're separate.
Yeah, echoes of it. Yeah. And my view, particularly at that time in 2011, well, one, I'm not ashamed of being Conservative. I'm proud of it. That's why I stood under the banner, and that's why, we've got all this history in Scotland, and I'm proud to be a Conservative. So there was that part of it, but also in 2011, it would have been absolutely impossible for David Cameron to come to Scotland and say, let's keep our country together. And if Alex Salmond could turn around and say, shut up, mate, you can't even keep your party together. F off. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like you
absolutely,
just
yeah,
couldn't do it. It made absolutely, for me, no sense at that time. And to be honest, I think if the deputy leader hadn't had that as his main proposition for his leadership, he would have won at a canter rather than some untried, untested 32-year-old, lassie that had been in the parliament 5 minutes.
And
Completely think that's to happen.
do you think there's any credence in that argument now? I mean, because the people on the other side of the
Well,
coin would say, look at what's happened in Northern Ireland. If you had an equivalent of maybe someone like the DUP, have a more localised
although
offering.
our equivalence was always the UUP and them and the SDLP, were the big parties at the time that devolution happened, and you've seen that that's now cascaded to the DUP and Sinn Féin, and there's a question mark around the polarisation of politics in Northern Ireland. But I don't actually think that you can map the politics of Northern Ireland onto any other part of the United Kingdom. Whether that's Scotland or Wales or England or
But people
anywhere
do,
else.
don't they? They try and make that equivalence when talking
They
about the
do.
separation of the Conservative Party.
And
in
I'm very
Scotland.
politely trying to push back against you and saying that that's just wrong.
Well, that's fine.
I don't see it.
Like I say, I think it would be madness myself, but given you're the expert in the room on Scottish politics, thought I'd try and push you for a clear answer.
But I think what's interesting is that same chap, Murdo Fraser, who stood against me, is standing in this election and is one of the two front runners. And he's kind of said now that that's not his view, but he's going to have a commission to decide whether we should be a separate party or not a separate party, rather than I'm just going to say I'm a separate party. And
it's not unequivocal, is it?
So it's slightly muddied the waters. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, if he wins, then let's have a look at what the commission that he sets up to make a decision on the thing that he's believed his whole life comes back with. I mean, I have a view, but if he doesn't, then I think that's the debate closed again for a little while.
What I find fascinating about the conversation that we were having, and to be fair, Ruth, it's not a conversation I thought we were going to have that much detail on, but there are some just fascinating parallels here. Crisis of confidence within the Scottish Conservative Party. What do we stand for? Being proud, what is our offering to the general public? And this idea now, particularly post the general election in 2024, because of reform, and do we bring them back in? Do we bring them into the fold of the Conservative Party? Do we push against it? What is the offering as a UK-wide party for the Conservative Party? Where do you think the UK-wide party currently stands, particularly in light of the leadership election that we're going through?
Yeah, I mean, my strong advice to the UK party is let's not learn the wrong lessons from that election. And I think that it is very easy to do that. And quite often when you've been in government and then you leave government, the lessons that you learn is we just weren't Tory enough. And that's why we lost all those people that are swing voters. And I think we saw, after John Major left government, we saw, William Hague was quite moderate, but then we decided that the electorate didn't like us, so we weren't Tory enough. So we went to Ian Duncan Smith, and then we weren't even Tory enough with Ian Duncan Smith, and we went to Michael Howard, and then only then when we decided we'd been out of power long enough that we would quite like to be in power again and have a Conservative government, we went for somebody that talked to people that weren't already voting Conservative. And I think we always have to keep one eye on who is it that either used to vote Conservative or haven't voted Conservative yet, that might vote for us in enough numbers to allow us to become the government.
Where do you think the party is at the minute on that?
Do you know, it's funny. We seem to be having... I think maybe it was the timing of the election being in July. I mean, I can't remember a leadership election where it's been so quiet for so long. If you look at the number of MPs that have declared for the candidates, for example, I mean, it's a handful, an absolute handful. And I think people are just waiting until the Commons comes back to really kick off, and for
I suppose there aren't that many Conservative MPs at the moment.
But you've got but I'm saying that there's like 25 that have declared.
Well, but again, that's nearly a quarter of the Conservative Party, right?
Well, no, the Conservative Party is much more than its MPs, as I have spent a lifetime trying to argue, as you should do too, Ben.
No, we do, but unfortunately the way that the party has decided to structure the leadership elections is it's the parliamentary party that will really take the lion's share of that debate until we get to the final two.
Yeah, exactly. But so I think, one, we kind of need to sort all of that out, and two, we also have to be pretty clear about what reform is, what it stands for, how much of it was a protest vote, how much of it people had read a manifesto and thought their policies were good, how much there is a personality at work. And Farage is, whether you like him or loathe him, he is a powerful operator. I think there's also a recognition of, if you lose more than 150 seats to the Labour Party, if you lose 60 seats to the Liberal Democrats, and if you lose 5 seats to Reform, who is it that you're fighting to get seats back from? Where's the low-hanging fruit? And I think as well, if you look at what Kier Starmer was doing with his first big speech in the Rose Garden just last week, I think you take heart. I mean, I said on my own podcast that I know this sounds crazy, given that we've just had our worst election result in a century or whatever it is. But I looked at him and I watched him do the speech live, and I was just thinking to myself, you've not got it. Whatever the X factor is in politics, Kier Starmer does not have it. He's not connecting with people. He had all summer to write that speech, to deliver it, whatever. He had the ability to show us things about himself, to do light and shade, to take us on a journey, to explain what Britain was going to look like in 5 or 10 years, or what he was trying to get to, all of that sort of thing. He did none of that. And I was just looking at him going, you are beatable. You are immensely beatable. Now, he might get better. Sometimes it takes people time to, put on the cloak of being a prime minister and be prime ministerial. But, in terms of how he communicates and talks to the country, he's miles off of where some of the really good communicators are that we've had in the past. And, if I was the new leader in terms of the leadership election that's happening now, I would be wanting to go, throw everything at the May council elections to try and take chunks out of Labour and start showing that renewal story early. Because this guy is beatable.
And something I talked about before the election as well, but particularly after the election, we know how broad and very shallow the Labour win was, but it was significant. You can't ignore that. But yeah. I know this is word gymnastics, but we lost the election. Labour didn't win the election, and I think there's something really powerful.
But governments do lose elections, Ben.
Well, they do, of course, but at the same time, if you look at the Labour vote share, you look at their offering to the country, the fact that they, again, you talk about people reading manifestos. I don't think even if people had read the Labour manifesto, they would have seen much of interest in it. It kind of felt to me like, even then it's going to be winnable. The question, I suppose, is a practical one, because I think you're absolutely right. Everything you just said, I agree with Ruth. But the issue is we're left with 121 MPs. We are no longer, sadly, we may be in May, and I think you're absolutely right. That's the first challenge for the Conservative Party. We're no longer the largest party in local government. There is now an operational issue from the Conservative Party side because of the defeat that we suffered. You know what it's like. If you suffer that kind of serious defeat, a lot of the infrastructure can fall away, members become disillusioned. So it's easy to say that he's beatable, because absolutely at the moment he is, and like you say, that might change. But what should a new leader be looking at to help rebuild? Again, a bit like in the Scottish image, really. How do you go from a very low base and start to regain that confidence, rebuild those structures, and allow us to go through a methodical process to get to a place where people will trust us again?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. So you lose a ton of infrastructure and a ton of the kind of support mechanisms that you get from having an MP in a constituency or other tentpole politicians. And that's why the council elections will be important between now and the next general. And we've got a couple of iterations of that because of the way you guys do it down south, of having, those kind of rolling ones of a third and a third and a third, which I think is mad, but you guys seem to like it, so crack on. Yeah. I think there's two things. You've got the air war and you've got the ground war.
Yeah.
So the air war, just by dint of being the leader of the official opposition, you will get a certain amount of coverage. You will have to fight tooth and nail for the rest of it. And how you establish yourself, what people think about you, whether you're the right person to lead the party, if people can connect with you, if you're able to pull a team together that actually doesn't fight like ferrets in a sack. And party discipline at a parliamentary level has been a huge problem for us in recent years, and we need to get it back. If we look like we mean business and we talk to people's concerns and, we pick and choose our battles, because what's great about going from government to opposition is you don't have to have an opinion on every subject. You don't have to. You don't have to pronounce on everything. You can pick and choose where you intervene, and learning that, because it's different skills in opposition, learning that, how do you take chunks out of Labour? Let's do that. And also, how do you talk to the country? And how do you get noticed? Because all of all of the media is going to want to look at this new government, this shiny new thing. So how do you chip away at that and get the coverage that you want? So there's that part of it. And then there's the ground war. How do you build up? How do you identify where you can claw things back? Where can you put people and have, kind of people that you can hang campaigns off? And if we don't have MPs, then that has to be councillors. So we have to really take the local government elections between here and the next general very seriously to build up that infrastructure and communities that we can hang campaigns around. And that also means making sure that the people that we put up for council elections and winnable wards are people who will continue to campaign for the Conservatives. They're not just people that will go to council meetings, as important as that is, or answer correspondence, as important as that is, but they also have to be Conservative activists that will do and be a kind of candle for other activists and leafleters and phone call makers and all the rest of it to hang around. So we need to build that part up, and we need to make sure that we've got paid coordinators in different parts of the country, maybe across 2 or 3 different constituencies, organising it and making it happen, doing all the grunt work of it. And the reason that I say that that's important is, so 2017, if you remember, was the snap general election that Theresa May called. And again, if I just use my own example in Scotland, we started off looking at a 100-seat majority and ended up losing the small majority that we had. And if it were not for the thing that nobody expected to happen, which was the Scottish Conservatives, riding over the mountain and getting 13 seats, which nobody thought was possible, there was a chance that Jeremy Corbyn could have put together a government. It's these small things that hang off it. Now, that was our best result in Scotland for 38 years. That's how bad things had got. We went from 1 MP to 13, which doesn't sound a huge amount, but it was just enough. And the reason that we managed to do it was because in Scotland, there were council elections also in 2017. And the whole of Scotland goes to the polls at the same time. So it's quite big, and it's on all the Scottish news and it's on all the papers. And when the snap election was announced, it cut right across that campaign. So we made the strategic choice. I actually made the strategic choice. Sat with HQ and said, no, we are not moving a penny of our campaign spend out of the council elections. We're going to fight them as we blueprinted it, and then we were going to use that because we knew we were going to have an uplift. We didn't know by how much. We knew we were going to have an uplift. I said we're going to use that as the springboard for the second half of that general election campaign. So we don't move any money, any resource, anything. We make sure the council elections are the most important thing when we fight them, and then we springboard up to the general. And what that allowed us to do, because we more than doubled our number of councillors across the country, we put on over 100 councillors. Because we'd done that, that allowed us to go into seats that people thought were well beyond our capabilities to fight. So we went into Alex Salmond's seat. We put him out of Parliament. We put him out of professional politics in a seat that he'd held for some years, because we were able to show we won this in the council elections. He is winnable here. Vote for us. We were able to show in other seats where it might have been a 3-way tie that actually Labour were out of the game. So we were able to take on seats, in sort of Dumfries and Galloway, where that had, been SNP, it had been Labour, it had been Tory in the last 30 years, it had moved around. We're able to take that seat. We're able to get Angus Robertson, who was the SNP leader in the Commons, out in Murray, because we were able to show that we were in with a sniff. So I personally believe you fight every fight as it comes as the most important fight there is. Yeah, you can keep your eye on the general election, but if you build up credibility in a local area, if you build up councillors in a local area, if people can see folk like them, who talk like them, who live in their street, serving their community, wearing a Conservative rosette, they will be warmer to us. They will listen to our message. They will think, well, if this guy's a Conservative, maybe they're all right. Maybe I'm a Conservative too. Absolutely. So all of these council elections between now and the next general, so important.
Absolutely. And all politics is local, right? And it's one of the things that the Lib Dems have always done incredibly well, getting at a local level, embed, and then build from there. We can learn lessons from other parties as well. Just jumping very quickly back to the kind of the air war bit. Yeah. What's your view on the length of the leadership election? I mean, because what we've got is a budget that's going to happen before the new leader's announced. It's going to be after conference as well, which tends to be a bit of a marquee opportunity for the leader of the opposition to get at least some voice on the airwaves. Do you think it's too long? Do you think it's right? Or do we need, some people think we need this kind of time to reflect and build on what a vision the Conservative Party is. But at the same time, we're also leaving the playing field for a couple of months to the Labour Party to try and define the next certainly 12, 24 months of the political conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an imbalanced decision, but on balance, honestly, I would rather walk to the right decision than run to the wrong one. Particularly when one of the things that our opponents are throwing at us is that we've had 5 leaders in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
We're practically Italy here. Like we need to give the next person that comes in the chance to lead and to build and all the rest of it. So actually, yeah, I also think in terms of some of the choreography that you've talked about and the main events, I don't think there's any harm whatsoever in having Rishi Sunak be the person that responds to the Labour budget because of his time in the Treasury, because of his time in Number 10. He understands the numbers. And that job, that response to a budget, is probably the single most difficult job in the Commons because you don't see it in advance. And nor do you see the red book that accompanies it, which tells you actually where the money's spent. All you do is hear what somebody's saying, and you have to make assumptions about what that means in terms of spend and how they're spinning it. It is, if that was the first outing for a new leader and they flunked it and they weren't very good at it, that derails their first 100 days. So actually, and it's a tough job. I mean, if you think of John McDonnell throwing the red book across the table from Mao Zedong and making an arse of it, if you think about I actually can't even think of a good budget response ever. I can't name you one. And I'm quite a good political watcher. I like watching these things. I watch them all live. And I can't think of one that stands out in my lifetime that was a corker. They really got the Chancellor there.
And I think for me, you're absolutely right. It's a difficult job, and you can make the argument absolutely. I mean, Jeremy Hunt is extremely strong. Rishi's extremely strong. So their immediate responses to the budget will be as strong as they possibly can be with people who've both been in the Treasury and have been in government very, very recently. I suppose from my perspective, it's more if you, at the moment, the shadow operation, that team you talk about, the new leader having to build, CCHQ, the air wars afterwards, the responses in the afternoon, the morning afterwards, and over that following kind of 24, 48, 72-hour period, tends to be after the budget, fight in the chamber. It tends to be the following 72 hours that define the success of the budget and how it's solidified. By not having a proper opposition and a team in place, are we not vacating that field to allow the Labour Party an easier ride to be able to define the budget, which, from what we're hearing being leaked out and the rumours in papers, with a strong opposition, there's a huge amount for an opposition to pick holes in.
Yeah, there is. I still think that we can pick holes in it. I also think that sometimes an error by your opponents is more valuable than a hit that you've landed by yourself. And I mean, I think they're going to have to change the tone quite significantly from what we saw from Kier Starmer by that budget. I mean, if you look even at the polls that have closed already, if you look at his approval ratings, that went down like a bucket of cold sick in some quarters. People that had voted for him that are now, wondering about what happens next. And they've got a decision that they have to make as well. They've obviously decided, given the way that this is going, that they're going to use all their political capital now and then say, look how far we've turned the tanker around when we get to the next general election. Absolutely. Look how far we've come. You've all tightened your belts, and that means that we can now give away X, Y, and Z. That's the political calculation that they've made. But they're not doing it in a particularly clever way, in a particular way that is bringing people on the journey with them. In terms of, if you think of kind of previous messages, so if I think of kind of Cameron Osborne talking about when things had changed, and we went from the party of spending the proceeds of growth, if you remember, pre the crash, to post the crash being about, there was a story that went along with that. The reason we're doing this is because it's not fair for us to land our debts on our children. That's why we're closing the deficit. It's not fair if our budget interest, just the interest on the it's not budget interest, sorry. It's not fair if the debt interest, so that's not even the country's debts, that's just the interest on the debts that we're paying each year is more than we're paying on the NHS. That's not fair. So there's a real fairness argument that went along with it. And, I think that sort of with one hand and with the other. So we are doing this in order that this can happen. We are doing this so that we can do that. We're having a public sector pay freeze so that we don't have to lay lots of people off and then hire them again in 2 years. And you've got 2 years of no income. So
Yeah.
they were always doing the second half of the equation. And actually, I personally think they did that quite well, and they took a lot of people with them on that journey. I think we as a party stopped doing that when we started outlining policies of explaining the why as well as the what.
The why, absolutely. 100%.
And I think the Labour Party aren't doing it at all at the moment.
Well, it's also,
and that will get them into trouble.
It's also a difficult place for them to be, because what they want to do is blame the Conservative Party for all the ills of the country and Conservative government. There is a reality that we spent more than £500 billion on COVID that might have had something to do with that as well. But actually, some of the core structures of our current economy are nowhere near as bad as they were after the 2007-2008 crash. So they're almost trying in a very basic, simplistic way to do the George Osborne thing of, we've inherited something terrible, we're having to make tough decisions. They didn't want to have, you're absolutely right, didn't want to have that real conversation during the election campaign, so they didn't take people along with them. They haven't built that narrative over the last couple of years. And now they're also finding that, we are growing significantly, people in employment is still at record highs. And so I think there is also a natural kind of justice to this, in that you can't also run that when the facts on the ground are not perfect, but they are different to what they're trying to sell the public. It goes back to this point of authenticity we started at the beginning. It's inauthentic to say, and to try and gaslight people into saying that the economy is in one way and therefore we're having to do things in a different way.
Yeah, although there is a warning in there for us. So all of the things that were pinned on that Labour government, Gordon Brown's the Prime Minister that sold the gold. That's the government that didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining. There is no money left. All of that we pinned on them, we did it really successfully, happened after we were in government. We didn't land those punches in opposition. We did it in government when we had the microphone and when people were listening to us. So there is a real warning to us about being able to have our answers ready. And I think one of the things that's going to be a challenge for the new leader when they come in is, what is the Conservative narrative from our time in government? Not what is our opponent's narrative that they're going to put on us, which is going to be about chaos, and it's going to be about Brexit, and it's going to be about debts, and deficits and all the rest of it. What is our narrative? And I think what we're going to struggle with is the fact that we had, like I say, a number of leaders who all did different things to the person before them. And if you try and draw a through line of one, or multiple policies that were developed sequentially under each leader, you really struggle. So whoever comes in is going to have to tie together what the story of our time in government was. Now, part of it can be COVID response, and I think that's a very fair one, and particularly on things like the vaccine programme and all the rest of it. Absolutely. Part of it can be about our role in the world, so helping Ukraine, giving British overseas passport holders in Hong Kong the right to come here. Some really kind of good, strong policies there. But beyond that, we chopped and changed. So we took people up the mountain on more national insurance so that we could pay for social care. Then we marched them back down again by cutting national insurance and getting no particular benefit for it. We did a lot of stuff under Cameron on things like overseas aid and the 0.7%, and then we reversed it. So we can't talk about that in terms of our place in the world. We have talked quite a lot about our own defences, but we've cut the number of people within our army. So we've got real problems in identifying, when we come to tell our own story, what that story is, because it's a number of different stories. So I would just say to whoever's coming in, let's also address that and have people in your team that are giving real thought to that.
Yeah, I'll put you on the spot here, Ruth. If Ruth Davidson was the leader of the Conservative Party, you're in the leadership election, you've just been elected with a landslide majority from the members. What is your narrative? What is your communication along that? What would you be doing if you were in charge now to be able to set that narrative of what we did in power and what the future of the Conservative Party is going to be?
So I think what I would try and do is I would make it a necessity-based approach. So quite often, Conservatives in government are given credit for doing what needs to be done, but not necessarily credit for having the best intentions while doing it. People don't necessarily think that we're the soft, cuddly people, but they do think that we're good managers. And personally, I think one of the things that caused the election result to be as bad as it was and the gap to be as wide as it wasn't just the kind of Partygate and losing the moral authority under Boris. It was Liz Truss and losing this idea that there was competency, managerial competency. Yeah. So I think we have to start rebuilding the competency idea, and we treat that as a kind of black swan moment, an aberration that happened, but talk about doing what needed to be done with the furlough scheme. We stepped up when it was needed. When and things like Ukraine, we stepped up. So starting to have that idea of we do the right thing, as well as talking about speaking to people's values and what is it that you need and what's the ambitions that you have. And I think the bit that the Labour Party is missing right now is the hope, because everybody, irrespective of who they are, who they vote for, left or right, has a basic ingrained part of them that wants their politicians to tell them that their children can have a better life than they've had. So they can have a better job opportunity, they can have a better education system, they can have a better chance at getting on the housing ladder, they can also then go on and create a better life for their grandkids. So how do we start doing the politics of aspiration and talking about aspiration not being a dirty word? And how can we big up Britain? Because people have been down on Britain for a really long time. This idea that we're in decline, we're a busted flush, nobody listens to us now, all of that sort of thing. We've got the opportunity to redefine what Britain in the world looks like. And I think that talking about that, not in a I've got 16 flags behind me and the other guy only has 14 flags behind me, therefore I'm a bigger patriot bullshit that we see quite often, but talking about that in a kind of sensible way, building alliances. In opposition, you've got loads of freedom to go and meet other people in different countries. Go and use it. You're not running a department. You've got more time as a politician if you're, the opposition spokesman for foreign affairs or home affairs or education. Go off and listen to people. Go and learn. Let's have a bit of humility. Let's go start building alliances and allegiances and building constituencies of purpose as well as constituencies of place. And if I was the UK leader, one of the things that I would absolutely do is bang on about education as much as I could, because the education and attainment improvements under the Conservative government outstrip any other part of the United Kingdom. And this is easily measurable because you've got different systems everywhere. And, that speaks to that aspiration that we all want to talk about, is how do you give your kids a better chance? Well, give them a good education first, give them the chance of that, drive up standards in schools. And we've got a really good story to tell on that. And that is one thing that has lasted through every administration since the coalition.
And out of the leadership contenders that we have, who do you think that person is? I mean, I don't know, Ruth, actually. I don't know whether you've declared or whether you're going to declare.
Yeah, so I have declared. So I'm backing James Cleverly. I think he has the best chance of pulling all the different factions of the party together. And I think that we need somebody that can talk to both left and right within our party. I like the fact that he has done a number of big jobs and done them well, both in the Foreign Office and the Home Office. In terms of his background in the army and as a businessman, I think he understands and can talk to lots of different people in the country. And I also think that, he conducts himself in a manner that I like to see. And I think that the country likes to see. Politics has gotten pretty spiteful and quite gritty and quite small lately and quite petty. And actually, he always conducts himself in a kind of, it sounds so old-fashioned, but I don't know if it's the officer in him or what, but in a kind of gentlemanly fashion. And I want to see somebody that can bring that sense of, that sense of not decorum, but presence to the job as well. So he's who I've backed.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think we're just about out of time, Ruth. Really pleased that you could come on. That's fantastic. I'm sure people of the Blueprint podcast listening will find that really, really informative. Good luck with everything that you're doing, and it's been great to have you on.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you for listening to the Blueprint podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home with me, Ben Houchin. Remember, you can like and subscribe on all of our social media channels, and you can catch a new episode every single Wednesday, wherever you get your usual podcasts from.